Hello and greetings to all. I'm Heather Tallis. I'm a visiting scholar at the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota and a visiting professor at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley in the United States. I was selected by the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES, or the MEP, as part of a group of experts to support the MEP in scoping a future IPBES assessment on the interlinkages among biodiversity, climate, water, food, energy, and health, or the Nexus assessment. The scoping report for this assessment will be taken up at the 8th plenary session of IPBES in June of this year, and the public document of the scoping report can be found as IPBES 8/3. I'm happy today to introduce some of the key features of this scoping report. Starting with its objective. The objective of this report would be to critically assess the state of knowledge on the past, present, and possible future trends in the multi-scale interlinkages among these Nexus elements. As this is an IPBES assessment, it would focus on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people, and also importantly, on informing development of policies and actions that can and have influenced the Nexus. There are several aspects of this assessment that make it unique. The first is its focus on interlinkages across multiple sustainable development goals. Many past IPBES assessments have looked at the interaction between biodiversity and one element of the Nexus, but never at these many interacting pieces. This diagram is one that the scoping authors use to help us think about and organize the many interactions that would be assessed in this report. Another unique aspect of this report would be its focus and inclusion of interactions between human health and biodiversity. This is not something that IPBES has looked at strongly in the past, but given the current global pandemic and its connections to the environment and increasing impacts of climate change on human health, this is an aspect that would receive a deep treatment. The report also would have an emphasis on response options, and importantly for the Nexus viewpoint, how each response option creates synergies or trade-offs across the multiple elements of the Nexus. The assessment is meant to be conducted over about a 3-year time period, which would position the findings to be useful for several ongoing multilateral processes. For example, the Convention on Biological Diversity's updated strategic plan for 2021 to 2030, ongoing progress towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and ongoing progress towards the Paris Climate Agreement. The assessment would be global in scope with explorations across different global regions, providing an ability to see differences and similarities across those global regions. All major ecosystem types would be considered and included, ranging from freshwater to terrestrial to marine systems and their interactions in socio-ecological contexts. Interactions are key to this assessment, and each time an interaction is explored, it would be looked at in terms of its environmental, social, and economic costs and benefits. So there would be information about both positive and negative interactions, not just about the environment, but also about its relationships to our society and economies. The temporal scope would stretch from 50 years in the past through the current period and up to 50 years into the future to 2050. There would be the opportunity to extend the historic explorations to earlier timeframes if that was informative to particular response options, and the same for future explorations up to the year 2100, as those might be relevant to specific response options. The assessment would address a wide range of several overarching policy questions. I won't read through these here, but in general, they aim to ask how have past and current approaches to managing water, food, energy, and health impacted biodiversity, and vice versa. As mentioned, in particular, how does biodiversity and nature contributions to people contribute to human health? How can synergies among the Sustainable Development Goals be maximized? And what are various response options for addressing climate change and sustaining biodiversity that also sustain food systems, water, and health? In particular, how is equity foregrounded in different options as in terms of how they affect Indigenous people and local communities? among other overarching policy questions. The Nexus assessment would contain 12 chapters in a first part that frames the Nexus, and in a second part establishing pathways to sustainable futures. I will go through each of these chapters in more detail. The first part of the assessment starts with chapter 1 and introduces the Nexus. This chapter would provide definitions of the elements of the Nexus, place the Nexus in the context of the IPBES conceptual framework, and in the context of policies and the scope of the assessment. Chapter 2 starts the historic-looking consideration of how Nexus elements have interacted in the past and how they exist today. Chapter 2 would focus just on the two-way interactions between biodiversity and each of the Nexus elements. This provides a close and deep look at the biodiversity interactions with the various components of the Nexus. Chapter 3 looks at the more complex and higher order interactions, so any interactions with biodiversity and at least two other elements of the Nexus. So for example, this chapter would look at past trends in the interactions among biodiversity, climate, water, and food systems, among many other interactions. In both chapters 2 and 3, there's close attention to attribution, or which types of policy or response options in the past have created particular situations in these interactions across the Nexus. Chapter 4 starts the future-looking part of the assessment, asking how future interactions might exist across the biodiversity, climate, water, food, energy Nexus. This chapter would include many types of scenarios, including exploratory, policy screening, and target-seeking scenarios. Each would look at a range of positive and negative consequences for both nature and nature's contributions to people, and how they relate to progress against the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and other existing multilateral agreements. This chapter would also identify positive components of scenarios that represent more sustainable futures. This would set up and pave the way for the second part of the assessment. Part 2 focuses on pathways to sustainable futures. This would be the bulk of the assessment, and so I'll go into slightly more detail on these chapters. Chapter 5 starts exploring the policy and socioeconomic and sociopolitical options across the Nexus that could facilitate the transition to a range of different sustainable futures. This chapter would explore both theoretical and practical frameworks that would support transformative change in the context of the Nexus. This chapter would identify and assess specific policy and societal options that promote sustainability in the Nexus through a variety of different kinds of changes. For example, changes in the economic and financial system, changes in governance structures, either formal or informal, changes in cross-sectoral management, or changes in social constructs beyond governance. This chapter would identify and assess the factors that can facilitate or obstruct these changes, laying out the enabling conditions for the types of changes that might be possible and more sustainable. This chapter would evaluate the implications of different perceptions of a good quality of life, recognizing that there are different versions of what is constituted when we talk about good quality of life, and how different policy options would measure up or perform against those different perceptions. And finally, the chapter would evaluate the roles of education, technology, social equity and justice, and Indigenous and local knowledge in creating the kinds of changes that are explored. Chapters 6 through 11 then build off of chapter 5 and take specific sector entry points to exploring how the kinds of overarching changes identified in chapter 5 could be created. We take this sector entry point because although we recognize that the Nexus is strongly interacting, we know that our governments and our economies are still strongly organized by sectors. This chapter design allows us to meet that structure and identify particular actions and response options that are available through each sector as a starting point. So each chapter takes a different sector entry point, starting with chapter 6, that would look at options for delivering sustainable approaches to water. Chapter 7 would look at delivering sustainable approaches to energy. 8, sustainable approaches to food systems. 9, sustainable approaches to health. 10, sustainable approaches to finance, and 11, sustainable approaches to biodiversity, conservation, and use. Each of these chapters would follow a similar format, addressing a consistent set of issues. First, each chapter would look at the response options that can be advanced to create the types of changes identified in Chapter 5 through individual or collective action within the focal sector. This again provides that starting point to meet decision makers where they sit in terms of operating now in our governments and economies. Additionally, each chapter would look at the response options that require joint collaboration across multiple sectors, emphasizing how each sector can contribute to those kinds of joint actions. This expands beyond the sector-based viewpoint and shows how individual sectors can collaborate for multiple impact. Each chapter would also explore the potential for nature-based solutions as one set of the response options. And each chapter would look at the ecological, social, and economic costs and benefits of each response option taken through each sector's entry points. Indicators would be explored for tracking progress on the types of options that are considered, and these would be related to existing indicators, for example, for the 2030 agenda. Knowledge gaps would be identified for each sector, and case studies would be provided as relevant. Chapter 12 produces a summary and synthesis of the options that have been presented across the report, and also of the knowledge gaps and opportunities for capacity building. This chapter would bring together the key findings and summarize all of the previous chapters, especially those in part 2, identifying opportunities for action that are related to any systems within the Nexus. This chapter would distill the key findings on costs and benefits that had been laid out sector by sector, identifying the key conclusions on how those relate to each other, both in terms of costs and benefits of actions and of inaction. There would be an emphasis here on transformations that can be driven by individual sectors and by multi-sector collaboration, clarifying what kinds of actions are needed for different types of outcomes identified throughout the report. And finally, this chapter would synthesize knowledge gaps and capacity building needs, especially identifying synergies and efficiencies that can be gained across all of the elements of the Nexus. This concludes the introduction to the scoping report for the Nexus assessment, and I thank you for your time and attention.